The ancient West African kingdoms were powerful monarchs commanding intricate political systems of city-states and organizations that all contained their own unique culture and language. The kingdoms and surrounding communities thrived and upheld a rich history and culture. West African kingdoms were led by mansas, or emperors. The king was their religious leader, chief of army, highest justice, and the economic leader of the empire. Most kingdoms contained their own standing army that kept the peace and policed the trade routes of the empire. Art, technology, and learning flourished in the kingdoms. Africans were specifically skilled in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. They traded items like bronze, ivory, gold, and terracotta amongst themselves. The African people left traces of iron weapons, intricate pottery and plates, clay sculptures, and masks. African luxury materials were not only local interests, because before long, European nations became curious and headed towards Africa in hopes of acquiring these lavish materials.
When the British came upon these objects in 1897, they thought there's no way they could have been created by Africans. They were amazed at the detail and the intricacy. They were seen as being something completely revolutionary to the British. And you can understand why.
African slavery existed for centuries before Europeans intervened, but it was not based on race and was not as cruel and dehumanizing. Africans sold each other as slaves before the Europeans even came to their continent. It was a large part of the economic side of the African kingdoms.
You know, there were African middlemen, and they would fight wars with other Africans to enslave them to sell to the white man. Slavery was a huge business for different African kingdoms.
The first traders to land on the West African coast were the Portuguese in the 15th century. The Dutch, British, French, and Scandinavians followed close behind. If slaves were not sold to the Europeans, they resulted in kidnapping and selling Africans in order to enslave them within their own kingdoms. The true beginning of the Atlantic slave trade did not formally commence until the 17th century. Europeans justified their actions of taking African captives and turning them into slaves by arguing that they were doing the Africans a favor of giving them the chance to become good Christians. The immigration of Africans to America became known as the Middle Passage. The journey, on average, took around 30 to 90 days. The African Americans were loaded onto ships and taken across the Atlantic Ocean for America. The Middle Passage is the specific part of the triangular trade between Africa and the Americas. The main good that was transported on this route were African American slaves. Upon boarding the ships, the Africans were stripped, lined up, and chained, and marched down into the inhumane storing facilities. Below, slaves were forced into positions in which one person's head, when lying in rows, was forced upon another person's thigh. The slaves were stored in the middle chamber of the ship called the slave hold, which was located under the main deck but above the cargo hold. Slave ships were made to carry 450 passengers, but on average, they carried approximately 600. The slave hold was unsanitary and inhumane. The stench of disease and decaying bodies lived throughout the ship. Malnutrition and dehydration left the slaves exposed to infection. Diseases were very common and led to a high mortality rate. It was common for slaves to not make the full trip and die on board the ships. If a slave was sick, Europeans concluded to throwing them overboard to prevent them from spreading their diseases to the other slaves. Slave ship captains were given incentives to deliver healthy slaves, so when people got sick, it was better to dispose of them. Suicide also influenced mortality rates. Many Africans would rather be dead than endure the slave conditions. Upon arrival of the European ports in America, sailors unloaded the surviving Africans. From there, the slaves were held until it came their time to be sold at auctions and markets and begin their lives as new slaves. In America, slaves had no rights. A slave could be bought and sold just like a cow or horse. Slaves had no say in where they lived or whom they worked for. They were commonly separated from their families during this time. Slave treatment was generally brutal, degrading, and dehumanizing. Whippings, beatings, starvation, execution, and sexual abuse, including rape, were common. Slaves were punished by lashing, shackling, hanging, beating, burning, mutilation, branding, and/or imprisonment. Even though slaves had no rights, African Americans helped build the economic foundations of the new nation. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 solidified the central importance of slavery to the South's economy. Slaves took on long hours working in the cotton fields of southern plantations. As slavery persisted, it became an issue that divided the country from the northern non-slave states to the southern slave states. A growing abolition movement in the North sparked the bloody American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Northerners began enlisting blacks to assist them in the fight for emancipation. 10% of the Union Army were African Americans, and another 19,000 African Americans served in the Navy. The Civil War ended in 1865, bringing the transatlantic slave trade to a final halt. Although the Union victory of the Civil War freed the nation's slaves, the legacy of slavery continued to influence American history and still does to this day.